Thank you all so much for joining tonight's conversation. I'm Christy Ross, Director of Health and Wellbeing with the NAACP, and I want to welcome you all to a very, very important conversation as we unpack mental health and the specific challenges that we have been faced with due to COVID-19. I am delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel of speakers, as well as our moderator, Holly Robinson-Peete, who will really talk about a very important conversation. And so this is safe space. It is hopefully a wonderful, productive space and one that is filled with great care. And so we are delighted that you all have joined us. We are going to have the opportunity for our audience to pose questions during the Q&A segment toward the end of our discussion tonight. And if you would like to pose a question, we do ask that you post it in the Q&A section and not the chat section so that we can make sure we properly vet your question. We are also delighted tonight to have NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, to be our resource partner. And we're going to be sharing the link shortly in the chat so that you are able to visit NAMI's website for resources in your area. Once again, I just want to say welcome. I thank the panelists as well as our moderator, Holly Robinson-Peete. And we want you to enjoy the conversation and hope that you get lots of really good information. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you so much for having me. I am so happy to be here. I think I need this conversation. Personally, I need this conversation. So I know everyone on the participants list needs it as well. I want to thank the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They're tonight's resource partner. And I want to encourage everyone to go to the NAMI.org website for more mental health resources in their area, in your area. So now I have the honor of introducing a fabulous panel. So we'll start with Ms. Letitia Johnson. She's a lifelong Mississippi resident. The Magnolia native, received her undergraduate degree from Tougaloo College and subsequently matriculated at Mississippi College School of Law to earn her Juris Doctorate. Upon graduation from law school, Letitia began a legal career spanning over a decade. Her experiences are comprised of past positions, including Special Assistant Attorney General, monitoring consultant for the Mississippi Department of Human Resources, staff attorney for James L. Henley, standing Chapter 13 trustee, and currently is a partner at JAB law firm. In addition to her commitments as a dedicated wife and mommy of 5, an attorney, Letitia demonstrates continued commitment to reinvesting in the Mississippi and Jackson community through service on the Jackson Public School Board of Trustees. Wow, that's a big job. And as an active member of the Jackson chapter of the Links Incorporated. So happy to have Letitia here. And next we have Dr. Sheena Walker. Dr. Walker attended Fisk University, where she completed her Bachelor and Master's of Arts degrees in clinical psychology. She went on to receive a doctorate in counseling psychology from Tennessee State University in Nashville, Tennessee. She has worked in a variety of settings, including university counseling centers, prison systems, inpatient programs, hospitals, in addition to working in academia. She is currently an assistant professor of psychology at the University of the Virgin Islands. I just want to go there just saying that. Clinically, Dr. Walker specializes in the treatment of anxiety disorders, issues related to gender conflict, men's issues, racial identity development, and substance abuse, chemical dependency issues. She's the owner and licensed clinical psychologist at Mind, Body, Health, and Psychology, a group private practice on St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And next we have Dr. Shervington, Dr. Denise Shervington. Dr. Shervington, I love her background right now. Thank you for the soothing images. Dr. Shervington has an intersectional career in public health and psychiatry with a focus on community well-being. She developed the post-disaster mental health and emotional resiliency division at the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies, a community-based translational public health institute she founded in New Orleans. a fellow of the American Psychiatric Association. She recently received the award for excellence in service and advocacy. Bravo. Dr. Shervington testified before Congress of the United States House of Representatives Committee on Oversight and Reform on Childhood Trauma. She also co-chaired the New Orleans City Council Children's Youth Planning Board Task Force on Childhood Trauma. Dr. Shervington is a member of the scientific board of the Center for Society and Mental Health at King's College London, and on and on and on. She is an amazing lady, and I'm so glad to have you all here. It is my honor and privilege to talk to you. And we're just going to get right into it on these questions, but feel free to overlap or join in. This is a conversation. I will ask you specific questions, but if someone wants to add something in, please hop in. So we're going to start with the big question. How has COVID impacted mental health and the well-being of Black people? That's a huge question. We'll start with Dr. Walker.
Yes, it is a huge question, but one that I'm glad that you asked, right? And so I'll provide just a brief sort of reflection on how quickly this really came upon us. So we know that on December 31st of 2019, the World Health Organization was notified of a few cases of pneumonia in a city in China. But by January 7th, we knew that it was COVID-19. And by February 2020, we already knew the COVID sort of spread across the globe, and the outbreak was announced as a pandemic then. And by then, we were all sort of up in arms and trying to respond and very, very quickly, right, to curb the spread of the disease. And so we put forth, or the government put forth, quarantine measures to try to do so, like I was just saying, curb the spread of the disease. But despite the efforts being, well-intended, it really limited our ability to be able to connect with one another and have that social sort of contact that we desperately need as a coping strategy, and one that we tend to rely on also as Black people. So that contributed to our distress. And then we also had constant news, right, of the infection rates, of death tolls, of the negative impacts regarding economic factors. All of that really impacted our overall feelings of mental wellness. So we know that research has since supported the evidence that Black and Brown Americans are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And although this really came out as sort of breaking news, we know that this isn't a surprise, right? So mortality rates were impacted by longstanding experiences of higher rates of chronic diseases that plague our communities. And so again, this increased the death rates of COVID-19, and the restrictions of being able to communicate with one another physically, sort of hug and embrace one another, really impacted our overall, again, well-being, especially as it related to grief, which later sort of created an experience of trauma. We have these feelings of not feeling in control, right, which leads to our anxiety being heightened in significant ways. So these dynamics are increasing mental health risks in our community and give us an urgency to really have this discussion. So even though we don't have as much research because of the pandemic being ongoing, we can extrapolate a lot as it relates to mental health for Black and Brown people and Indigenous folks as well, through our past experiences with epidemics, natural disasters. I'm here in the Caribbean, so we face natural disasters quite frequently, and as a result, we see, or through those situations rather, we've seen increased rates of post-traumatic stress as well as depressive symptoms. That was particular as well in response to the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, and as well as with the experiences of Hurricanes Andrew, Hurricane Ike, Irma, Maria, Katrina. So we can learn a lot about this information and understand that, unfortunately, Black and Brown people, of color, are notably vulnerable to these negative mental health consequences. But I'm sure some of you all can relate to this as well, because we have a really ugly past in mistreatment and medical care, especially towards Black folks. It led to a healthy distrust of providers, right, which led into lots of confusion about vaccination. And then with it being sort of politicized, it just led to, again, an overall ambiguity as it relates to how we should really manage this crises. And so again, that definitely plays into what research has also found, again, increase in depression and anxiety, in domestic violence rates and interpersonal violence, in suicide. So there's much that we can learn and much that we will need to continue to learn as we approach the long effects of COVID. So it's really going to require us coming together as a collective, like Dr. Shervington was saying in our preparation to come onto this call. So I hope that we'll be able to develop some solutions.
Thank you so much. It's funny you mentioned, not funny, but ironic you mentioned the storms, because it really does feel like an imperfect storm of things that happen, and we are recovering in that way. As a Black woman and as a mother, one of the things that was so hard for me, it was to try to navigate this for my children. I didn't have the answers. I'd never been through anything like this before. I had to dig deep into my Black mama bag to try to come up with explanations and try to manage their expectations and all of that. That was so stressful. And so we as Black women, and not just mothers, but just Black women in general, we have very unique challenges and circumstances. And I want to come to Dr. Shervington to just talk more about that, what unique challenges that Black women faced, that we had to face during COVID, that just really negatively impacted our mental health.
Continuing with what Dr. Waters said, for us as Black women, we oftentimes carry the burden of the family. For many of us, we don't have as much economic mobility compared to other groups. We see all the statistics about how much we make on a dollar, we're at the bottom. And so the pandemic was a stress, an economic stress, that then became a mental health stress for us. Many Black women are working in industries where if they didn't lose their jobs, many had to turn up in the service industry, in health, in food. And again, didn't have the luxury of, some of us who could sit in front of Zooms and do our work. The relief that it gave those of us who had that privilege, we realized how tired we were. And so for many of us, we had to continue with the ongoing stressors that we have faced since, coming into these conditions of the diaspora. Many of us didn't have access to the broadband that was needed. And let me not say it's just Black women. Let me think about our Latinx sisters, Indigenous sisters. We're about in the same boat. And so those were the external factors. But a part of how we have had to survive, how we've had to build resilience oftentimes has been to normalize stress. We keep it moving. If I hear one more Black woman say to me, I'm just keeping moving, I can't deal with this. Unfortunately, the pandemic, we had to deal with it. It asked us to stop. It forced us to stop. And the ordinary ways in which we used to live our lives, whatever was the usual way, that ended. We became separated from life as we knew it. And then we started to churn. One day it's this, one day it's that, and we're not knowing what to do, it's uncertain. And so for us, with all the external factors and what was required of us to really go inwards and think about how we're going to survive. Literally, death was facing us, and we saw death take many people we loved away from us. And I think that challenge for us I have seen it my years of seeing Black women in therapy. Usually the first part is let's just sit and breathe, just relax. Just, we don't have to go anywhere, just be here. And so I think we are going to have to get much more comfortable with dealing with our minds. And unfortunately, that previous to me was a survival factor. We just had to keep it moving. We live on the outside, don't care. We're now going to have to go in deep. And that's how we're going to make it through this, knowing our minds, understanding the connection to the rest of our being, and being willing to be present with reality and shift.
Yes to all of that. I'm going to go to Mrs. Johnson now, and just following up on what Dr. Shervington said, what self-care practices can Black women do to safeguard their emotional health? Are there some tools that you can give us?
Well, I can talk about what I do to dig myself out of anxious and stressful situations. During the pandemic, I think I'm an introvert, so my house is my, kingdom. And so when it started, we were good. And then all of my children and my mother-in-law and my husband and all the Zoom calls, and then it shrank. And I withdrew, and I didn't know I was withdrawing. And so by the time it ended, I had this sort of habit or system of falling into Netflix or falling into something to just not having to be present constantly with the people that I love the most on the planet. Before COVID, I was, exercise, meditation, yoga classes, all of the things, right? The things that we're taught to do to just sort of help us de-stress. And then none of that really worked. Of course, we couldn't go to the gym. And a friend of mine, probably about 6 months ago, sent me The Artist's Way. And I started getting up in the morning and doing a brain dump. And somehow, and of course, the two professionals on the panel can tell you why this worked, but it worked. And I still do it. And it takes about 30, 40 minutes, but everything that comes to mind, all of the, oh, you got to do this, and there's not enough time for this, and what about this, and what if this happens, all of that, up and out. And I found that helps me. What I tell my daughters is to set healthy boundaries and to be kind to yourself. What I know, being the age that I am, it's also helpful to have someone that is objective and that you can talk to and that won't judge you. And so that's why I think that this conversation is so very important.
Yes, it is. And I'm the brain dump. I'm doing that first thing in the morning because I try to do set my intentions for the day. Well, I have an app and I listen to it and I try to set my intentions. And so I can start the day off, being mindful. Now, probably about an hour later, I'm kind of back in stress mode again, but at least I set an intention. I think that is really important. And I also share that with my daughter too, to try to do that. So Dr. Walker, understanding that prior and during and now in the endemic stage of COVID, mental health, self-care is very, very important. How would you recommend that we start to, as a people and a culture, destigmatize mental illness in our community?
Yes, and again, thank you for that question. It's a great one and one that we just need to have. So even you're asking me the question, right, helps us to start combating. But let me just sort of piggyback on what the other panelists were saying. I loved what I was hearing in the fact that again, we should just be having these conversations and exchanging ideas on how to collectively move forward. So the the idea about stigma and mental health really isn't new, right, to our community. In fact, it really goes back to slave times, when it was erroneously thought that enslaved Africans didn't have the humanity or maybe the sophistication, right, to develop depression or anxiety or mental health disorders. And so from those misconceptions, as a collective, we've learned to ignore our experiences, like what Dr. Shervington was saying. We keep it pushing, right? We keep it moving. We don't have time for that type thing. And unfortunately, those descriptions for actual maybe mental health illness or difficulties with the management of our mental health is usually called, just stress or being tired. So we pass these things on to our generation upon generation, and we ignore what's going on with us. And so, Holly, you were just mentioning mindfulness, right? Mindfulness is a technique to where you are focusing and trying to show up in the here and the now. It's wonderful for us to set intentions for the day, but what often happens, like you were saying, you get caught up into that automatic pilot. You start telling yourself what you should be doing, and the should sort of take you out of the present moment. I always tell folks that I'm working with that the formula for anxiety is either focusing on the past or focusing on the future, both of which you can't control, right? But what you can control is your breath, and right here in the here and the now. So we need to start to again, to further answer your question, to combat stigma, we really need to continue to talk about our experiences and in real ways. Again, how you were talking about, metabolizing the feelings for your children so that they can get a sense of, what's going on. We all need to do that. And sometimes, again, if we don't have the language, we can rely on one another to help ourselves to identify what's going on. But even so, if that's not readily available for you, again, like what Mrs. Johnson was saying, people like myself are here. There's therapists that look like you as well, right? That can relate to your story, and that will hold water. Meaning, the experience of therapy is really quite like talking to a girlfriend, but one that won't sort of pass along what's going on within the conversation. So what I'll say is, one, ask some of your friends and family, have you ever experienced therapy before? If so, maybe you can learn something from that experience. Again, it could bring more awareness, right, to your experience in that, and maybe it was a helpful thing. So educating ourselves as well, and again, trying to find the language to identify what it is that we're going is going to be extremely helpful. And if it's, again, hard for you to identify the language, that's why we have groups like NAMI. NAMI is a wonderful source to learn about mental health wellness, how to manage your mental health hygiene. So what we could all do, right, and including myself, even though I'm in the field, I have to continue to sort of keep myself in check my own attitudes and beliefs about seeking help, right? Because it is something that the concept of, having to carry everything on our shoulders is something that, again, goes way back. And so if we start talking about how we're doing, I think that we'll be able to stomp out the stigma of related to mental health. So.
Thank you so much. You mentioned that here we are, women having this conversation, but one of my biggest frustrations is not being able to find a provider that looks like me. I just don't see them. It's very frustrating. I have a lady that I talk to. She's a nice white woman. She's fabulous. I love her. She's great. But I do feel, how would I benefit by talking to somebody who had a similar life, or, just processes the world the same way I do, or similarly. So, the numbers are not good. Unfortunately, women of color make up less than 5% of psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers that are available to treat patients. So my question to you, Dr. Shervington, is what can we do, if anything, as a community to increase those numbers and expand our access to connect with more health professionals of color?
Mm-hmm. Might I just follow up a little bit on what Dr. Walker was saying about destigmatizing mental health?
Please.
I find that when I connect the reality of the mind with my being, then of course we have to address our mental health. Our mind, it's the only organ in our body that we know, if we think about it. We don't know our kidneys, we don't know our lungs, we know our mind, which is the conscious representation of what's happening in the brain. And our brain's primary function is our survival. So the mind is interpreting and communicating what the body needs internally to stay alive with what's out there in the environment. So there should be no way that we're separated from our mind. It is the conscious awareness of our being, and it is keeping us alive. It's interpreting, it's what's happening in the brain, what's happening in our kidneys, whatever, all of that is churning. The mind, what's happening in our sensations, we're bringing in from our environment. And through our mind, we become aware of what those needs are. And the extent to which we get our needs met is the extent to which we can be content. So we have to know our minds. We have to know, we have to understand it. And we have to know which pieces of it, those pieces that are resisting reality, those pieces that want to deny reality, because that's what mental illness is, when we're not living in reality to a large extent. I am fortunate that I chair the Department of Psychiatry at Charles R. Drew University in South LA. We train psychiatrists. We also have a specialty that we're bringing on in child psychiatry. And what we really need, you know, it's important for our therapists to look like us, because it just takes some of the work out. But we have to be careful sometimes that we don't over-relate and we're not paying attention to what's really happening in the mind of the other person. We're here to help them to understand. Someone not of color can be a good therapist, but they would have to be very humble. They would have to have no assumptions about who we are. And what we're supposed to do objectively is pay attention to the processes in someone's mind. I think I'm a really good therapist with white, Latinx, and other people, but it requires me to make no assumptions about who they are and what their experiences have been. So there are, you know, the HBCUs, the Black men, I'm speaking from the position of a psychiatrist, but there's psychology, there's social work, there's counseling, but we are trying really, really hard. We try to collaborate in our research, in evidence-based. We want to be the ones controlling the research about us. And we want to encourage those who look like us to consider, again, I can only talk for medicine, consider a career in medicine, which means we have to go way back. We have to go from someone reading to our kids, we or someone else. We have to go back to elementary school, high school, because we need a certain academic track to get into the science of mental health wherever we come from. So we have to start making education important again. I work with a lot of kids, and you know what they say when you ask them what they want to do? They want to be rich. That's the number one thing they say, I want to be rich. And it's like, okay, how are you going to get there? What are we going to do? And we have to, you know, there are popular ways in which kids now feel that those are the only things they can do. And we need to put back the joy of learning and curiosity. And that will pepper more of us, I think, into these fields and into other fields. I just want to see our kids enjoy learning. That will make us capable of being whatever kind of professional we need to be. We need to get rid of this value of, I want to be rich. I don't know, for the past 2 generations of kids, I work a lot in the schools. They just want to be rich. They have no idea how they're going to get there. We need them to go back to the ways that got us here, a community caring, encouraging, us being really, really collective. I am here because people around my village helped me. And I'm sure many of us are here. We're going to have to get back to that. It's killing us, this isolated kind of individual life that we're living. It doesn't work for Black people.
Thank you so much. It's talking about young people. I have 4 young adults. It was hard for me to say that. I have 4 young adults that I'm raising. I guess I'm not raising them anymore. No, you never stop raising them. And, you know, during the pandemic, young Black people and the people who serve them, such as teachers and parents, were experiencing some of the most difficult times. As you mentioned, you talked about these young minds and they're really off track. And so as we move forward, what does it look like, Mrs. Johnson, to ensure that we're really taking care of not only the mental health of the student, but also the teacher and the parents that they interact with on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think it goes back to what Dr. Shervington was saying, education. I think we need to look at the curriculums of individuals that are studying to be teachers. In the interim, I think that we need to change their continuing ed to make sure that they understand their students. School districts also need to take responsibility in their parenting engagement program to do some wellness informing or education. I think that we need to normalize mental health as part of health. Schools are really good at teaching kids how to be healthy, what to eat, and how to exercise. I think we need to transition that to also include mental health.
And if I could just piggyback off of that, we're seeing more and more, and we're doing this even in the U.S. Virgin Islands in our territory. We're trying to push for legislation to include psychologically informed curriculum, such as like emotional intelligence, so that we can, again, start giving the language not only to the teachers, who, bless their hearts, all of you educators are out there because you are front line, right? It gives you the language and the skills to be able to process what's going on and to better manage, you know, your stress as well as the children. And so I think this is something that really ought to be infused into our curriculum from K all the way, pre-K actually, all the way through. So again, there is a focus of physical health as well as mental health and spiritual health and all of that. So I'm hoping that it's something that could be, you know, spread across our nation, really.
Absolutely. And I just want to reset for anybody who joined us late. You know, we're having this amazing conversation about COVID-19's effect on mental health. And I want to make sure that everybody goes to the NAMI website, because that is a great resource for a lot of the questions that if you have. We're going to get to a lot of your questions, but just in general, it's a great resource, and you can find resources near you on that website. And I think Christy put it in the chat. So very, very excited to be able to have resources, because that's really the takeaway is like, where do we go? You know, where do we go? As you mentioned, Mrs. Johnson, which is like, you don't have just mental health resources and emotional health resources at schools. It's like one of the things that is missing. It's so glaring, and financial literacy, but that's another topic. But these are things that we really need. We really, really need them. Couple more questions, and then we can start going to the questions, the Q&A. I think we're getting a lot of good questions, and I know that people have questions for you all. So I want to get to those. I think we covered a lot of the questions that we had. Prioritizing mental health of our young Black people is very key. I just have a personal question, and someone else might relate to this. We talked a little earlier, I think, Mrs. Johnson, how you said what you told your daughter, and just getting back to sort of talking to our kids as mothers, as Black mothers, experiencing the last couple of years and all the things we go through, and processing not just COVID, but obviously all the other things that are going on externally. I internalize too much. I mean, I'm taking on everybody's problems as if I don't have enough to deal with, and internalizing so much. I see myself putting that on my children, right? They see me stressed, they react, and then they get stressed, and they just, it sets off a sort of a domino effect in our house. And we're 6 of us. So it just nonstop sets off these wheels in motion of anxiety. And, as I'm trying to practice mindfulness every day, and I try to get my kids to do it too. I sent them all these apps. I got them trying to meditate, and they're playing music that does not. It's like they're playing hip hop for their meditation. I'm like, that's not very relaxing. But okay, if you're zenning out, all right. But just trying to get, what else can we tell our children? What kinds of things can we tell our children as we start to, or as we continue to try to move ourselves out of all of this? And then how do we stop internalizing so much? Even, the 4 of us spoke briefly earlier about the Supreme Court hearings. It stressed me out to a place that I had to turn it off, but then I had to turn it back on because I didn't want to miss anything. Then I was running to social media to try to see what the latest soundbite, and ready to take my earrings off and jump through the screen. It was so stressful. And as Black women, boy, did we really, really go through it with that. And so I think it's worth talking about, because we are still dealing with COVID times, but that experience, and I know a lot of Black women who are on here felt that. Is there some kind of, and this is to anyone, some kind of advice you might be able to give to us to sort of maybe dampen down the internal conversations that we're having about everything going on?
Let me add to your question.
Okay.
I also would like to know, because I came away in the end thinking we have the numbers and she will be fine. And I want to know how we can stop doing that to other Black women, setting these expectations that whatever we have to deal with will be okay.
Yes.
So I'll go ahead and jump in there. I think, Holly, like what you were saying, needing to sort of hear the next soundbite and maybe hearing about what other people are thinking about the event and the incident. And like what you were just saying too, Letitia, and sort of placing and projecting expectations onto each other. Again, this just, I think, identifies the need for us to metabolize our feelings. We need to be able to process what's going on with people that we could do it that are safe, right? So it could be friends, families, sisters, sorors. It could be coworkers. But again, if you're not feeling safe to be able to do that, because some of these conversations can be very provocative, right? That's when you seek therapy. I know earlier too, you were speaking of the difficulty in being able to connect with therapists of color. But there are some websites that we all could frequent to seek out therapists of color. So blacktherapyforgirls.com, blacktherapyformen.org, and the Association of Black Psychologists has a directory of psychologists and counselors in your area. So you could seek out, if you want, that support. But just going back to the concept of metabolizing our feelings, it goes also for our children. Our children will look at us. They don't see us providing language to what it is that we're going through, right? And then start projecting their deepest, darkest fears about what's going on, right? Because that's what we do when we're faced with ambiguity. We project our insecurities. And so again, if we can name what it is that we're feeling, watching the hearing, I felt irate, irritated, and a bit defensive. Like you were saying, you were ready to hop through the, the screen, as was I, right? So we could talk about it. We're angry for having to feel like we have to sort of defend ourselves. But the key to processing our emotions is to feel them, observe them, and then let them go. Because we can so often get caught up on those feelings, and that can cause us distress within itself. So again, notice your feeling, label it, and watch it pass. That's sort of the art of mindfulness. It sounds very simple, but it is a skill that we all have to develop. And the more that we can process and understand what it is that we're going through, the more that we can learn of other women's experiences, the more we can combat, Mrs. Johnson, what you were saying, that sort of that notion of, you know, we'll be just fine, because that really does propel the stigma, right, about mental health. So we just need to talk and rely on one another. Yeah.
Yes. I love that. That's part of one of the, you said, those are the keys to mindfulness. Just, you know, acknowledging and taking notice of what you're feeling, and then letting it go across like a cloud, and letting it go. And that is the hardest part, right? Because I'll do that, then something else will happen. Then I got to take on the world. I mean, we're not going to go into it, but I know both of these gentlemen at the Academy Awards, I couldn't sleep all night because of that. I'm just taking on too much. And I think all of us are, as Black women, as Black people, everyone had something to say. And so just trying to process these things, to take them in, and to really not overdo it, right? And really not overload and distance yourselves from some of these conversations that can become very toxic. And you can just end up going round and round and round.
I want to add that we will never have enough therapists for dealing. All of us need a therapist, so we're not going to have enough. So, you know, there's some integrative community processes that, you know, indigenous cultures have used that we are probably going to have to rely on. We have some ourselves. And what I think is really important is for us to begin to create spaces. That this is what we did in New Orleans. No one was coming to save us, absolutely no one. And we had to turn up for each other. Those of us who are professionals, I went into schools, I sat with kids. So there's a lot of psychoeducation we can do. And there are processes, indigenous processes that are ancestral, or we can borrow. There's a doctor in Brazil who has done this amazing, created this process for the favelas when people are poor, but community turns up for each other. We listen to the kind of pebbles other people are having. We listen and we think about what's happening in us. Have we had this experience? Can we share what we did? We're not giving advice. We're just saying, when I had this problem, this is what I did. And then, of course, we have an amazing capacity for creativity as Black people. We're right there. Every time I feel a little sad, I go hit Alvin Ailey, Revelations, and I'm set for a week. The amazing, beautiful bodies, so graceful in the air. So we have very positive things in our creativity. We have to get back to nature. Part of what happened, I know in the Caribbean, when slavery was over, we said we never want to be on the land again. And so, of course, we moved up into the mountains, but still we removed ourselves from the land because it was so painful. We have to look at that mechanism and say, maybe we need the earth again. Maybe we need gardens in our home. We need to grow things. So there are things we're going to have to rely on ourselves and each other to get most of us through this, because most of us will not be able to access, unfortunately, and speaking to a professional person. But as happened in New Orleans, if those of us who are professionals find a way to expand our reach, We are responsible for each other. I feel responsible for every kid in New Orleans who is struggling. And if we all did that and came together, we could create much more healthy communities collectively. We're suffering collectively, and there are pieces of this we're going to have to heal collectively.
I love that you mentioned the creative outlet, because we are creative people, and my daughter's, writes poetry and we sing, songwrite, and that was one thing. My son does a little music, so that was a lot of what I encouraged them to do in lieu of, along with speaking about their feelings, but also, just to really tap into their creativity. As young Black creatives, they're unbelievable what they do. And so I think that's really, really key. And I love these websites you gave us, Dr. Walker. These are great. Maybe Christy can put those in the chat, or someone can put those in the chat, because I think I just felt better hearing the names of them. They were really, really good. So now I think we're just going to just seg to some of the questions we have. We have some pretty interesting questions from our participants. And just FYI, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A section. I see some great comments, but also some questions coming in through the chat. And I'll try to read some of those too. But one I have here, COVID is still impacting our communities. There was very limited resources for the frontline workers for psych, and actually no pandemic money support. Most of who were women of color. My dogs are growling at each other. So it's just that's how we roll these days. Now that resources are limited, what can we do to have this recognized? I spent 2.5 years, I think she meant to, on the battlefield of COVID as a first frontline worker. Special funding should be given for psych. Anyone want to respond to that?
I absolutely agree. We asked our essential workers to put their lives on the line. This is like sending people to battle. I used to say that just like with veterans, when they come back from war, they get compensated if they have mental distress. We might need to look at that federal program of compensation for distress caused by acts in people, teachers, people working in food services, of course, the healthcare industry. We put them in a war zone. Any day they went to work, they could have died. We're going to have to get comfortable to think about what the pandemic did. It told us that there was this little invisible thing that could kill us. We go around we don't want to think about these things, that we could die in a moment. And some people, the doctors that I'm around, every day in the beginning, it could have been their last day. And they saw people for whom it was their last day. In our communities, the nurses aides, the ones working in the front in hospitals, teachers in and out. So I think as a society, we're going to think maybe they should be compensated, just like we compensate our veterans who go to war, come back and have mental distress. I'm all for it and will support any activities. Been pushing for that from the beginning.
Absolutely. I have another question. What would you say are some of the myths and misconceptions that Black women have in regards to seeking out therapies? Ms. Johnson, would you like to weigh in on that?
So the first thing that came to mind was, I would say there are a lot of Black women that just don't think they need it. I think we've sort of been trained to be quote unquote super women. And a lot of things we just sort of take for granted this is just life. So that's what I would say. I would say the biggest thing is that we just don't, even though there's a stigma, I think the other issue is that we just don't really think about us needing it.
We got this, we can handle it.
Yeah.
I'd like to also jump in there and to say, I think a lot of times when Black women, we think about, if we come into therapy, I might be labeled as crazy, right? Mm-hmm. By the way, That's a curse word. That's a word that I'd like to invite all of you to, assess your relationship with that word. Again, because you could be using it to propel the whole, stigma regarding mental health again. But we all need support. Because you might be coming to a therapist or a pastor does not mean that you are, and struggling with your sanity. What it means is that you might be enduring some stress and can learn about ways to manage it. So the C word, I also ask all of you to try to take it out of your vocabulary.
Hey, Dr. Walker, see, now you just messed me all up. Why? Because my my production company is called Crazy Mama Productions. So I'm gonna have to figure that one out. I'm gonna have to figure that out. Maybe I'll change it to Cray Cray or something. I don't know.
No,
Using
that
your
doesn't
creativity.
mean you just have a healthy relationship with the word.
Well, yes, but no, I hear that, and I think that's very, very important. Thank you for saying that. Thank you so much. I feel the same way about the R word, about retarded, and that's the whole thing I have with a special needs son. So I'm hearing that, I'm embracing that. I think we have another question. I believe my dog is barking. He wants to go for a walk. I believe that we have a gene that causes us to be on defensive as we see this majority trying to erase us. Ooh, that's deep. Do we have to have our own history classes? I'm not quite sure where she's going with that, but I think this is really about the cultural, the early days and the origins of how we think of ourselves and our mental health. Now I'm forgetting who mentioned, I think it was you, Dr. Walker, that said that we weren't even perceived as being able to have the ability to even have anxiety or process depression or anything. That is really pretty phenomenal to hear that. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah, we also have racialized trauma. In addition to the everyday things that create tension and conflict, our unconscious collective carries the trauma of racism. One of the things I've been trying to, there's some, scholars out there thinking about why does one group of people can only have a sense of who they are by diminishing who someone else is. So that they're going to have to do that work. And, there's psychoanalytic thinking about us having a jouissance, an enjoyment of life that the other doesn't have, and they see in us and they want to dominate. However we want to come from, understand the psyche of someone who has to build a hierarchy, that the only way they can exist is to be superior and another one inferior. So, but unfortunately, we have borne the burden of that. We were 3/5 human. As Dr. Walker said, we were told, my husband in the 60s was told he was a psychiatrist who wanted to be an analyst and was told he didn't have what was needed to go into analysis. There's still all of those myths about we are not good enough, and we carry that. So two people had a fight in a thing. All Black people felt it was us. When white people do crazy things, they go, that's the individual. They don't get, when they do things and harm us, they used to go to lynching parties and have a picnic, and they didn't blame, they didn't hold each other accountable for this. So we have been harmed, and it's also a strength because we're much more collective in our suffering, in the things we do, and also in our healing, which is why I think it's so important that as mental health practitioners, we're used to primarily working with individuals and groups, but we're going to have to work with communities, the collective. And when we step in the collective, to know we're part of that suffering group. We've all suffered from racial trauma. So I understand that question. And it's part of the work that we have to do in addition to everything else we have to do. hopefully the other people will do the work to understand their need to keep others down. And I refer people to the work of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She has a couple theories about why a group would need to dehumanize and try to totally wipe out other groups of people who don't look like them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shervington. Thank you for that nuanced answer, and also for that reminder that that when one of us does something, that doesn't mean we all do, and we should really get off that self-blame or that collective thought. Another question I have here that I think is very good. What are some prerequisite steps a person can take to make a transition to a mental health career? The demand greatly eclipses the supply. Well, Dr. Walker gave us those, she just put in the chat, those awesome resources. But what about that question? Are there other steps that we as people can make to transition here to a mental health career? It's a great question.
So the question really excites me because, like Dr. Shervington was saying earlier, there is a need for more folks of color, right, in the mental health field. So I'm going to do a shameless plug. So I'm here in the St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We here have a master's program where you can learn a lot about the applications of effective therapies for persons of color, right? And it's not just the University of the Virgin Islands that has programs, but we have a number of programs in our HBCUs. Fisk University, Howard University has a wonderful program, and a number of them. So interestingly enough, as it relates to like the prerequisites, a lot of you might not have a background in psychology, but there's a lot of transferable experiences and skills that can go into it. So if you're interested in pursuing a career in psychology, there's not just psychology, by the way, there's also social work that can also work in mental health, nursing. You could also work in mental health. You could have a focus in psychology instruction as an educator as well. So there's a number of ways that you can involve yourself also in the field. And also we have life coaches as well, right? That can oftentimes help people to reach their goals. And so that's an exciting question to know that there's interest out there. So I'll also make myself available if there's any, questions about how you could specifically get yourself involved. You could always sidebar me and we can have a discussion because that's exciting to know.
We have another question that I think is also pretty interesting. I've heard this question, this issue a lot. How do we deal with mental health issues as a Christian who hears from family and friends, you don't need a therapist, you're a Christian? I think that's it's a really important question, because a lot of times I remember when I met my husband and we started dating when he was just my boyfriend, and having gone through therapy and experienced therapy, counseling, he had never done that. And I had to make it a litmus test. Like you, because when things get bad, we may have to go do this. Are you willing? He was like, sure. He said anything I wanted to hear at the time. But we did eventually end up going, and his parents were so upset with me. They were very upset with me. They're like, you taking our son to a shrink, and you're not, and what are they doing to him? And we don't believe in that. And, we read the Bible, and we God gives us our therapy. And so what would you say to someone who would say that? It's a very common statement that I've heard in my own experience. Anybody can take this one. Anybody want this one?
I'll speak to it. What I'll say is, One, there also are counselors that are very much so informed, right? So there's Christian counseling if you're not so comfortable in maybe speaking to someone that comes from more of a traditional, psychotherapy or counseling sort of background. But the one thing that I'll say is you will be surprised at how much overlap there is with Christian values and therapy. Oftentimes, too, your therapeutic experience is just about reflecting um, the values and things that are important to you, right? So just know that, like, for example, one of the things that I suggest highly or recommend or prescribe is prayer. That's the first thing that I prescribe for folks that I'm working with, right? And so there are a lot of commonalities in in counseling, and like I said, in some of the values that we learn through Christianity. But I'll also say, if you're uncomfortable altogether, speak to your pastor. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, they're usually trained in counseling theory. And so I'll just ask you to try to, again, stretch your brain to considering the idea. And again, if we can talk to each other, we'd be surprised as to how comfortable the experience is. So we might have to walk out on faith too, as it relates to counseling, is what I'll say, or receiving help or receiving that support. So,
A dear colleague of mine in New Orleans, who is a pastor and a social worker, we worked closely together on the trauma task force there. And when he heard that question, and only he could say it, I'm just saying what he said. He would say, sometimes us, the church, not the teachings, but us in there, we're the source of a lot of trauma in people's lives. So we cannot dismiss the need to get help. And I guess I want to clarify what therapy is. It's a process of getting to know oneself. Therapists, I am not of the school of therapy. We don't tell people what to do. My role is to listen and to facilitate a deeper understanding of self. There is no conflict there with any religious beliefs, none, absolutely. There is no, many therapists will take a very neutral stance. There's some who do, and that's okay if that's what you want. But therapy is only, you're having someone having to listen to you and try to figure out how your mind works. That's it. And try to help you understand it. There is nothing else that's going on. So it should not in any way conflict with any religious beliefs that one holds. And if that's happening, then that person's therapeutic approach, they need to be perhaps challenged. We're not there to change people, to create new people. We're helping people understand how they have created the personalities that they have that are responding to the world around them. And if they feel that they need to change, then we support them in that. But the therapist's role is not to infuse any kind of dogma or change any dogma that exists.
Thank you so much. Another question we have is very similar. How do we break away from the old saying, what happens in this house stays in this house? I think that this saying alone prevents a lot of us as the minority from getting the help we need as it relates to mental health. I would love to know how to encourage my family on how to seek mental health therapy. And you just, Dr. Shervington, just gave us a definition of therapy that I think definitely helps for us to take back to our families. And this person also said, thank you for this seminar. This is such an awesome conversation. And so if there's anything else you want to add to her question, keeping things in the house and not taking it out in the streets. And that's sort of a sort of distorted view of what getting counseling, seeking counseling is. It's a very private conversation, but some of us are not comfortable with that.
And just to expand on what you were saying and what Dr. Shervington was saying on what therapy is, I can understand people's uncomfortability, right, with sharing personal information about their households. And however, what's talked in therapy is also confidential, like you were just saying, right? And so what you speak about, unless there's obviously dangers to the person themselves, what's said in therapy will stay there. And so I think that that's really enticing, and that again, it's to help to improve on family dynamic, that is a goal, right? The intention is to support the family and not to tear it down. And so sometimes it'll take us, reaching out, and really encouraging very heavily with information about what we're learning about what therapy is, to our family members, to try to push them into that experience. So.
And I would like to say that I think we need to think of therapists as other professionals that also have confidentiality requirements, lawyers, doctors, teachers in some circumstance. So it's a professional field that has its own ethics.
Somebody said in the chat, recognize secrets keep you sick. I thought that was pretty interesting. Keeping things in, not being able to get it out can really ferment in your body. That hit me. Well, we are getting closer to closing out the Q&A. We had some great questions, and thank you to everybody that submitted the questions. I want to just encourage everyone to go to the NAMI website and check out the chat for some of the other resources we have. And at this point, I think I want to say thank you to all of you, but I want to give you each a chance to just give a little parting information or shout out, whatever you want to say. This has been so personally for me, this has been really helpful, and just an opportunity to sit in a room, virtual room, with women that we all sort of speak the same language in a lot of ways, but we learn so much from each other. So I think I'll start with Dr. Shervington. If you want to, anything that you want to add that you haven't had a chance to say, anything at all.
We've talked about the challenges of the pandemic, and it's still here with us. I just want to close out by saying that the pandemic has given us some gifts. It asked us to stop and really become a little more aware of who we were as people, to pay attention to some of these realities of existence, that, as we're born, we're going to die, that we have to chart our sense of meaning in life. It also reminded us that as much as we might love someone else, at the end of the day, we're isolated in our experience of life. And so what that means in terms of intimacy. And it also kind of taught us a little bit about at least mental freedom. So I want to encourage us to use this lesson of the pandemic to go deeper, to live from deeper inside of us. And as the young people say, in their internals. Life has forced us to be very surface. That was survival. I think we need to shift a little bit more into a deeper awareness of ourselves, our mental states, and that of others. And I think if we do that, we can find more Zen in our lives when we know ourselves better.
Yes, Mrs. Johnson.
I would say the best lesson I learned from this experience with the pandemic is intentionally loving myself. I was very, very good at loving my children and my family and friends, not so good at loving myself. And so now I set my intention to make sure that I do things, and I do them in the mindset of, I'm doing this because I love me.
I think that's an excellent message Mrs. Johnson, because it's, again, so often as Black women, we put ourselves on the back burner, right? And so, yes, the biggest lesson that I've learned is that we must practice self-care and prioritize it to come first. It might feel awkward because, again, we're caregivers and we do everything for everyone, but we have to do for ourselves first and foremost so that we can then have our cup runneth over, right?
Most definitely. So yes, this has been just an excellent conversation, and I'm so excited that we had a chance to talk. So many really great comments in here. People are saying, excellent presentations. Thank you all from the heart. Awesome information. I'm so glad I'm here. Thank you all so much. Blessings to you all. Someone commented that just like a lot of African Americans are brought up to distrust the police, many of us are also told from an old school belief that Black folks don't need therapy, that it's a white folks thing. And so there are definitely a lot of pretty awesome comments, but really thought-provoking comments in here. And thank you so much, Dr. Shervington. I know she had to go get on a plane, but thank you. It was just wonderful meeting you. This is just one of those things where we need to have these conversations. Can we talk again in like next week? Can we do this like once a week? Because this has been like therapy for me. This has been an opportunity to just share some things that not everybody understands. That's, I think, the hardest part here. Not everybody understands. And so this has just been a terrific conversation. And I wanted to hand it back over to Christy. Christy, is there anything else that we should cover before we say goodbye?
No, I just want to thank you all. And Holly, of course, you're fantastic. And I appreciate all of you being so vulnerable and really providing the audience with a safe space. I was glad I was off camera most of the time because this was just personally moving for me. And so I am happy the association could bring such wonderful information, but also safe space. I also want to say, to your point, Holly, I would love to do this every week, but this is also, this is a point at which I wanted to say, this is the beginning of a series for us. And so we are going to continue this conversation. We're going to focus on youth and young adults in our next session. And so please stay tuned, but thank you all for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for inviting me, Christy. Thank you to my friend Kyle Bowser for suggesting me and to do this. I've loved every minute of it, and getting to know these ladies has been great. And I hope that we can have more conversations like this. I'm always available, Christy, just call me. It's free therapy. Shoot, that's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
It's great to have this discussion. We have to be there for each other, as Black women. We have to be there for each other. That's so key. I think that's what we're learning. And I think, when I'm watching, we spoke briefly about the hearings, the SCOTUS hearings, and I've had some pretty good conversations with a lot of the Black women, and we're kind of all feeling a lot of the same thing. So it's good to talk about it. Note to self, don't over obsess with it. Let the cloud go by and move on. That was my takeaway. Oh, that and the brain dump. The brain dump is, I wrote that down. I will be brain dumping in the morning. And again, thank you so much for everybody. I think we're ending like 15 minutes early. Is that okay, Christy? Or do we want to?
Nope, I think mission accomplished. So
okay. Yeah, I think
we'll get some time back.
Yeah, you got it. Thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you NAACP for this amazing conversation. Dr. Walker and Johnson and Christy, everyone who participated and came on here, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your evening.